Oh, wait. I have your bulletin. Because I have two. Good morning, everyone. That little delay was not so you could decide whether you like my outfit. It was so everyone could get their coffee and get in here. We are glad to welcome you all to this special Sunday School hour in which our speaker will be Shane Claiborne. For those of you who weren't here yesterday and don't know who Shane is, maybe you're living under a rock, but Shane is a prominent speaker, activist, and best-selling author. If you have not read one of his books, I would advise you to do so. Get one at whatever outlet you could get one at. There are a couple available in the gathering areas still this morning. Shane worked with Mother Teresa in Calcutta and founded The Simple Way in Philadelphia. He heads up Red Letter Christians, a movement of people who are committed to living out the words of Jesus, which are written in red in some Bibles. And so he is fueled by grace and love for Jesus and for God's people. And so after I pray with you, we'll get to hear him tell you a little bit about what he does and what he's thinking about this morning. Will you pray with me? Father God, we pray you will open our hearts, our minds, and our spirits, not just to hear, but to be stirred, to begin to ask you, what does this mean to me? What are you calling me to do, to think, to believe, and to be? What would you call us to change? Now, we ask you this morning to bless us, to bless Shane as he challenges us, as he encourages us and gives us your food for thinking, the spiritual food that we need to keep our lives on an even keel, or maybe to upset our apple carts so that something might change for us. We ask you to open our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen. Brother Shane.
Well, it has been a wonderful weekend. We had a great day yesterday, and we get to dig a little deeper this morning. Since it's Sunday school, we're talking. We're going a little deeper into the economic stuff, and the idea of the theme this weekend is live simply in a complex world. And even though it's Sunday school, I did want to start with a little video just to loosen us up, get us going. And the backdrop of this little short clip was we were talking to some of our young people in Kensington and North Philadelphia about economics and why some people have so much and why some people have so little. And I'm really convinced some of our best theology comes from the kids and comes from the margins. And so you can hear what they say. And if you're really good, there's a magic trick at the end, and I'll let you watch it, okay? So we'll watch this little clip.
So here we are. We're at 3200 Potter Street in a house that we fixed up. This used to be abandoned. Did you guys know that? This is an abandoned house, and this is a space where we hope to have some computers and art stuff for the kids to come and hang out in. And so we're here now with a bunch of the kids from the neighborhood, and we're going to do a little game. You guys, we've been talking about why we have so much abandoned houses like this in a neighborhood where there's so many people who need housing, where there's folks on the street and there's people who need homes, but then there's so many abandoned houses. And in the same way, there's a lot of people who need food and a lot of people who have extra food in their closet, right? So this is the situation in our world. 20% of the people have 80% of the world's stuff. And that means 80% of the world has only 20% of the stuff. So here we are with the kids. We've got 8 on this side and 2 on this side. 80% and 20%. Now we're going to divide up all of the food and toys and stuff. Deal? We just gave out school supplies in the neighborhood. Who all got school supplies? We gave out school supplies to about 400 kids. So let's look at what this looks like in our world. All of you would only get 2. And then you 2 would have all of these. That's crazy, huh? We got 10 of everything. So how many do you all get? 2. You would have to share 2 between all of you. And these guys would get all of those to play with, just the 2 of them. So we like to play Frisbee, right? You guys would have to share 2 Frisbees, and these guys would get 8. 35,000 children will starve to death today because they don't have enough food. Because what happens is you guys would get 2 and they would get 8. Folks need milk for their kids. You guys would get 2 and they would get 8. This is medicine here for a cold. So if we think about all the people in the world that don't have medicine, and that's what happens here, you guys would get 2 and they would have all of those. And it's getting ready to be cold, so some folks are going to be cold and only have 2 hats for all of you to share, while all of these hats go to folks over here. And see, they might even have extra hats in their closet that they could share with you guys, but they have all of this stuff.
And it's a shame because they do have all this extra food, and they know they do, and they also know that in the world there's people that hardly have anything at all, and they just keep it or sometimes even throw it away. We're gonna feel bad because while they're over there having fun and eating, and they're not cold and they're warm and they're having fun, we're over here starving to death, cold, and we can't play because we all can't share. We're supposed to share because that's what God meant us to do. As stewards, we're supposed to share, but we don't. Some of us have all this and some of us have this little bit, and it's a shame because it really is like that.
All right, so what we got here is a little water.
This is a magic trick.
This is God sort of pouring out all the stuff for us to share, all the food and things. We'll we spill a little bit. And if we shared that, it might look like it ran out a little bit, but I think if we kept sharing and we kept thinking that there's enough in God's hands that we would keep seeing that, and we would see like that as we think it goes empty, that there's enough, it kind of refills as we were sharing all this. And it might even seem like, oh, there's none there, it might seem like that's gone, but, and it might feel like that's gone, but really, it just keeps coming and coming. So I think there's enough for everyone's need, but there's not enough for everyone's greed.
Sweet.
That was fun.
Yeah. So, I'll tell you how I did that afterwards for $50. How about it? But I don't know if you heard that little line at the end, but it was Gandhi's line. There's enough for everyone's need, but there's not enough for everyone's greed. And one of the things, I don't know, as you watch that, as you look at the disparities in the world, I mean, we're living in a time where we have the largest gap between those who have and those who don't. The small group of people that have unimaginable wealth. We now have 3 people that own the same amount as 50 countries' entire economies combined. And you look at that world and the disparity of it, And it's pretty clear that this is not the way God set things up, right? And I think the invitation for us this morning is to imagine what it would look like to live into the economics of God's kingdom. One of the most consistent themes in Scripture is this idea that God's going to provide this day our daily bread, right? So one of the first places we see that is in Exodus 16. As you may remember, the Israelites are being led out of their bondage. And do you remember what they were making in Egypt? Bricks for what? Right, for the storehouses of Pharaoh, right? Now, I think that's important to notice, right? They were making bricks for the surplus of the empire while they were hardly able to take care of their own needs. And so as God's leading them into the wilderness and into a new kind of vision and economy, they start to get hungry. And as you may remember, they get a little nostalgic. You know, they were like, well, we weren't starving in Egypt. We're starving in the desert. And so God pours out manna from heaven. But one of the first commands that they're given, before they even have the 10 commandments, is don't take more than you need. Right? The command from God is to not store up for an extra day, that they're just to take one day's ration, each of them, and God promises there will be enough for everybody if you do that. If you begin to stockpile, then God says, I'm going to send maggots to eat it up. So it's really clear, like, you're not to take more. In fact, they're even to take one omer, one day's ration in the Ark of the Covenant as this kind of icon to remember this idea that you're going to have enough. God's going to continue to provide for you. And of course, we see that, that theme all through the Bible, Proverbs. I love where Proverbs says, give me neither poverty nor riches, for in my poverty I might be forced to steal, and in my riches I might forget my God. Right? So enough. And that's where I think this idea of the economics, the theology of enough, the idea that God didn't mess up and make too many people or not enough stuff to go around is rooted in that idea that we're to pray this day our daily bread, as Jesus says. And I think if we're really taking that seriously, that we're praying this day our daily bread, it means we're not thinking about tomorrow's bread so much. And we want to pray not just for my daily bread, but for our daily bread, right? For everybody to have the things that they need today. And certainly the early Christians understood that the communion table, the Eucharist, was a symbol of that too. And some of them, some folks have pointed out that it's interesting that the kind of sacramental meal of the Eucharist or communion is a combination of the bread, which is the stable, basic food that we need to survive. And it's not bread and water, right? But it's bread and wine, which is often seen as sort of more of a, elegant luxury for those that can afford it. So you got these two things together, the bread and the wine. Well, if you're Baptist, it was grape juice. But, anyway, you get the idea. And we're sharing that. And you see in Corinthians that Paul actually gets really upset about the communion table. And he says, if you look closely, I kind of learned growing up it was because we were coming to the communion table with sin in our hearts. And that may be part of it. But what Paul is very clear about in Corinthians is some of you are coming to the Lord's table hungry. And others of you are coming overly indulgent. And as scholars say, what was happening sometimes was that the people that had the luxury of not having to work during the day could come, and they had already eaten. They had already sort of started the party before the folks could get there that had to work during the day. And so there was this inequity that began to develop. And Paul says, you disgrace the table when some of you are coming to the table overly fed and others of you are coming hungry. And of course in Corinthians he says, if the one who gathers will not gather too much, then the one who can only gather little won't have too little. There will be enough, right? So this idea of enough, I think probably, I know I'm talking to here in Lancaster, probably a lot of us have really grounded ourselves in that. But I would suggest that part of our problem is not when it comes to the disparity or even where to start on, trying to change some of the inequities in the world is more of a relationship thing than anything. And that's what it was in my life. I'm convinced that part of our trouble is that we live in a world where those who have more than they need don't always have regular relationship with folks who have less than they need. And so a big part of our work in Philadelphia has been just trying to create spaces where people from different economics, people from different ethnic backgrounds, different life experiences can begin to build friendships together. And I really believe that fundamentally one of our problems is not a compassion problem, but just a geography problem, right? It's a relationship problem. As Mother Teresa said, it can be very fashionable to talk about the poor, but not as fashionable to talk to them and with them. And so we can talk about the poor without knowing many folks that are in poverty or folks that are incarcerated. We can care about it in our heads, but how does it make its way into our hands? And I spent a good chunk of time at a mega church outside of Chicago, and they incidentally, it was Willow Creek, and that was the name of the church I spent some time at. And it started as a youth movement. It was a youth ministry that grew into this mega church. It really had a passion for the early church in the book of Acts. And before long, it's 30,000 people meeting every week for worship. And but it started by young people going door to door, selling tomatoes and getting to know their neighbors, and that's what really intrigued me. So when I got there, one of the things that they did was the mission of Willow Creek was to make fully devoted followers of Jesus. That was their mission statement. Really beautiful mission statement. To make fully devoted followers of Jesus. And there were a lot of folks that were very strategically minded, and they wanted to measure, how are we doing on that? And it's a little tricky to measure fully devoted discipleship. But, they said, let's see if as people are becoming believers in Jesus, if their economic patterns are changing. That's one way to measure it. Let's see if their social networks are changing, right? Are they hanging out with people that don't look like them? Are they visiting people in prison, right? These are the things Jesus said we would do. So they did this survey, and to their credit, they released it in a little booklet, and it was called Reveal, because what it revealed, in their own words, was that they were better at making believers than forming disciples. And what they saw was that as people were becoming Christians, their social networks were not changing very much. They weren't necessarily visiting people in prison or going, and spending time with folks that were homeless or things like that. And what they said is a lot of our Christianity has become a mile long and an inch deep. These are the words of the folks at Willow Creek. And so I think in my own life, I saw that I became a believer in Jesus before I began to, kind of get into those relationships. And until our relationships change, I think there's not really a shortcut to that. I look at the things in, Matthew 25, and did you visit me when I was in prison? Did you share food with me when I was hungry? And so I think for me, I had to find ways that I could get in relationship to folks. And some of that's just by going into prisons with folks that are already going there, finding ways that we could volunteer in the recovery community or other places. And but the other thing that I began to see is that when our relationships change, it changes the way that we hold our possessions. When our neighbor has about the same amount as us, then we don't think too much about having 2 or 3 cars. But when our neighbor doesn't have anything at all, when our neighbor's sleeping in a cardboard box, it kind of changes things, right? And one of my experiences in India was, I learned a lot about this from Mother Teresa, who incidentally, Mother Teresa, when I got to India, many of the sisters, they didn't have hot water, right? I remember them explaining that they didn't have hot water, but because for them, it wasn't about guilt or shame, but it was about solidarity. And when their neighbors, none of them had hot water, but most of them didn't even have water at all. And so it was a way that they kept themselves sensitive to the struggle that was right next to them. And it came from that proximity, right? From realizing that if we take cold showers, it keeps us sensitive. Now, I'll have to say I have hot water today, but I think the point is that we are part of the spiritual disciplines, right, of fasting and things like that, are to keep us sensitive to those who are suffering and those who are hungry, to keep our hearts from getting too far from the hurting spaces in our world. And Mother Teresa also, I noticed one morning that her feet were quite terribly deformed. And if you were here yesterday, you remember I shared that when we went into prayer at 5 o'clock in the morning, we took off all our shoes at the door and we knelt down before the cross. And so I was right behind Mother Teresa and I saw her feet. And her feet were so terribly deformed that I wondered, if she had contracted leprosy or, something. And of course, I wasn't about to ask her. I mean, this is Mother Teresa. I'm not going to be like, what's up with your feet? And so one day I'm talking to one of the nuns, and she said, have you noticed her feet? And I said, yeah. And she said, her feet are deformed because we get just enough donated shoes for everyone. And she doesn't want someone to have a worse pair of shoes. So Mother Teresa's kind of made a habit out of going through the donations, and she picks out the worst pair of shoes. And over years of doing that, that's why her feet look like that. And I can remember, rehearsing in my mind all the Bible verses I knew in my head, of honoring the needs of others above our own, loving our neighbor as ourselves. And I also can remember whenever we would donate stuff to the Salvation Army, it was always the stuff that had gotten old, that the zipper didn't quite work right on that jacket, And so we would give that to the homeless. And Mother Teresa would be like, don't you dare. When you give to the poor, you give the very best. You give the very best because you're giving it to Jesus. And, that sense, I think also comes out of a place of joy, because I don't believe in guilt and shame. I think they're terrible things to motivate us. One of my friends says that guilt can be a good indicator, but it's a terrible motivator. Love has to be what motivates us. And that was really what motivated Mother Teresa. I mean, she saw the suffering, she lived in the suffering, and it changed her economics. It changed how she held possessions. It changed how they thought of hot water. But it was also a joy. I can remember this really wealthy guy was, I think, given like $1 million or something, Mother Teresa. And so he had said to her very winsomely, he said, I couldn't do what you do if someone paid me $1 million. And she said, me neither. She said, you couldn't pay me $1 million to do it either. I do it because it's what we're made for, right? We're made to love and be loved. So it's not about guilt or shame. And the best image I have of that was when I was hanging out with the kids, just like the kids on our block in Calcutta. One of the things that we did in India was Mother Teresa felt very moved by all the young kids that were on the street. So, I mean, that's, she started many orphanages and things like that. But there were still kids that were street kids. They were begging every day. That's how they survived. And some of you have probably been to countries where these kids, 8 years old, 10 years old, they live on the street. Some of them are taking care of a younger sibling. And so Mother Teresa said these kids are very special to God. But they haven't always been convinced of that. So we get to remind them of how beloved they are. So every Tuesday night, I think it was, we would have a big street party. And my job became to kind of help throw those little street parties. And we'd have a huge spread of food. It was like a banquet feast for these kids. And we'd play games and stuff. And had a few magic tricks that might bust out from time to time and whatnot. And then one day, though, as we started the party, one of the kids came up to me and he said, it's my birthday. And you could sort of see this, his whole countenance kind of just fall. And that put me in a little tricky spot because we weren't allowed to play favorites. You couldn't get, a gift for one kid and not get it for the 100 other kids. And I understood all that in theory, but as his birthday, I'd gotten to know this kid for a long time, and so I snuck off, decided I'll get him a little birthday present, nothing too obvious. So I just got him a little ice cream cone. And I come back and I said, "Happy birthday." And he goes nuts, and his impulse, his instinct is, this is too good to keep for myself. So he yells at all the other kids, right? And he goes, "We've got ice cream!" And he lines them up. He goes, "Everybody's going to get a lick." And I'm like, I'm in big trouble with the nuns right now. But anyway, he lines all these kids up, and he goes down the line, and he gives each kid a lick of the ice cream. And then, after like 100 kids, it's starting to melt down his hand. He just hands it up to me, and he goes, "Shane, we saved you a lick too." I'm like, awesome. I got this whole spit phobia thing already, in me. But I, did my best. And I think that's the real power of all this, right? Is that it's not because the stuff's so bad. It's because the stuff's so good that we are compelled to make sure that everybody tastes how good ice cream is. And if that were our instinct when it came to the blessings and gifts of God, how much different might the world look? So I always think of that as a good framework for thinking about how we share stuff. Because I think what happened in the early church is that they had these real relationships with people of different economic strata. And so when you were born again, right, when you had this vision that we are now family, it began to affect the way that we hold our possessions. So, of course, in the book of Acts, we see, none of them claimed any of their possessions were their own. They shared everything they had. The offerings were put at the apostles' feet, right? And it was distributed to folks as they had need. But I always think it's important to say that redistribution wasn't the prescription for community. It wasn't just socialism or communism. It wasn't that redistribution wasn't the prescription, it was the description. Right? It was the description of what happens when we have this family together. You no longer have rich or poor. You have brother and sister. You have siblings that are now holding things differently. But it also translated into a really radical economic vision of sharing, where they were sharing everything. And if you dig deep into the ethics of the early church, Basil the Great said, "We call a person a thief if they have more than they need." He said, first, we call a person a thief if they steal someone else's clothes. But shouldn't we give the same name, a thief, to the Christian who has more than they need while someone else has less? I mean, it was a really radical ethic, right? That if we have money in our bank while other people are poor, we've stolen it. And that's why Vincent de Paul, who the great charity is named after, the Vincent de Paul Center, he said, "When I give food to the hungry, I get on my knees and I ask for forgiveness because I'm only returning what was stolen." So it's a very different framework, right, for thinking about charity. It's not just this kind of noble virtue, but it's really beginning to live into an economy where everyone has enough. Dorothy Day said, "If I've got an extra coat in my closet, I've stolen one," because there's still people who are cold. John Wesley, I grew up Methodist, and he had a really radical economic vision that came out of some of this. And he said, "If I die with more than 10 pounds, may every person call me a liar and a thief because I've betrayed the gospel and betrayed the poor." And he said, "I get money. If I find money in my hands," John Wesley said, "I get rid of it as quick as I can before it corrupts my heart." Woo! I was talking to the Methodist bishops, and I said, I guess the question is, if John Wesley was alive, would he still be a part of the Methodist Church? And like 3 of the bishops thought that was funny. But anyway, I think that's the wild paradox, right, of how we can forget sort of the radical economy that we came from. And I think, the Anabaptist tradition, the Mennonites and Brethren and others in many ways have preserved some of that community, and the idea, sort of the Mennonite your way, that we're going to open our homes. Miss Suzanne opened her home to me while I'm here, that we're going to create this way of living into the vision of family that is not just about the economic and profit and everything that we see in our world. So we're trying to live differently. And I think what happened in the early church too, when Jesus sends the disciples out without anything at all, you're to take nothing with you. So if you read one gospel, it says maybe you got sandals, right? So maybe they got sandals, but they weren't to take anything extra. And I think part of the reason that they were to do that was to realize that not only were they to practice hospitality, but they were dependent on hospitality. Like they were actually the recipients of it. So when you go into a town, then people are going to welcome you into their home. And if they don't, then just shake off the dust off your feet and keep moving. That's what Jesus said, right? And the early Christians, one of them said something so beautiful. He said, I have no home. I have no house myself. But everywhere I go, I have a home waiting for me, right? I have no house, but I have homes everywhere. And that vision to be born again meant that we were entering into a really beautiful economy. But we've come a long way from that. And in our community, as we started sharing, we had to figure out, how can we live into this vision of, a different economy that's based on our rebirth, that's trying to love our neighbors ourselves. And there was a study that inspired us that was done by a theologian in the UK. And he studied the economics within the church, what we do with our tithes and offerings, right? And he released this study. It was called Embezzlement, the Sin of the Church. So he didn't mince words. But what he showed was that in most denominations, 90%, some 95% of church offerings are staying within the church community there, mostly to maintain staff and buildings, and arguably some programs that are meant to benefit the community. But still, very little of the money was actually going out to folks that are in need, like the early church did. So he said we kind of spun the whole thing on its head, right? And we've kept money that really was intended to go out. And what that did for us was, rather than picking on the speck in the mega church's eye, we began to try to get the log out of our own eye. And we started a collective that we called Relational Tithe. And we said, we're going to start with 10%. And all of us will give 10% of our incomes together. And all of that money will be given away to folks in our community. And the only caveat for it is that we're only giving it to people that we know. So it pushes us to be in relationship with folks that are struggling, and then to invite everyone to be a part of this economy. And so we don't give it to any organizations or nothing we read about in newsletters, but it's how we've been able for 10 years now to give away hundreds of thousands of dollars in relational redistribution. So when there's we've sent kids to college, we've gotten people dentures, we've paid for funerals, we've created jobs in Cuba, we've done all these things through sharing with individuals that are a part of that collective. So now we've got affinity groups kind of all over the globe that are sharing locally, but if they have a need that's bigger than what they can meet on their own, then it comes to the larger cluster of collectives. And it's been a pretty fun experiment. So I share all of that, just as ideas to stir up things. And I know that, there's a lot of collectives that folks have already done. The way that we did healthcare for a lot of years was, I heard about a little group of folks that didn't have medical care, and they decided we've got to do something together. And inspired by the early church and the way they shared, they said every month we're going to make a list of who has medical expenses in this little community of 200 or 300 people, and we're going to pull our money together in order to meet those needs. And it grew from 200 to, I think now it's over 20,000 of us that still every month get a newsletter, who's in the hospital, and we pull our money together, and we're doing, I think last I checked, like $15 million a year or something like that in sharing that. And CNN came and they were doing a story on this, and they said, is this a silver bullet to the healthcare crisis in America? And my friend had a really great answer. He's like, well, no, it's not the silver bullet, but it might be a part of the silver buckshot, right? And if you don't get that, sorry. It's maybe a Tennessee thing. But anyway, like there's not one solution, but it's a part of it, right? Our government can do more to make sure that those who are most vulnerable have health care, but so can the church. And in many ways, we need to be more creative too to figure out how to do that. And there's challenges, but it's only 25,000 people, not but those little experiments I think hold possibility for what it can look like to live into that economy of rebirth. And it's all very relationally connected, So now we have a lot of congregations that are doing compassion funds or ways of sharing that all of that money goes into the community around them. So I want to pause there because we've got enough time that I don't want to do a monologue, but leave some time for dialogue. So let me just pause for a second and see if there are thoughts or responses or questions that you all have on some of the things that we've started to stir up. So I don't think we really prepared a microphone so much. So just talk as loud as you can, and I'll repeat it a little bit.
So I'm wondering if you have had...
Thanks, man. Yeah, great. Okay, yeah, for the live stream. Yeah, I think you're on.
So I'm wondering if you have had some direct contact with someone who is super wealthy. And is it as simple as saying what Christ said to the rich young ruler, sell everything and follow me? Or is that realistic? And what would we say to them? And let's pick on the Walton family, since most of us here probably at one time or another have been into Walmart, one of the wealthiest families, if not the wealthiest family. And what is it we would say to them? Stop being innovative, stop being industrious, don't create wealth, or do something different with the wealth. And how much is enough, and what is the fair share? So
yeah, thanks. It's a great place to start. And well, I probably won't name names, but yeah, we've got a lot of relationships with folks that have a tremendous amount of wealth. And some time ago, one of them asked what I would do with $1 million, and so I said, probably the first thing I would do is spend about $300 or $400 on it to fly you into Philly so we could hang out and I could introduce you to some of the folks that have changed my life. And maybe we could go in one of the prisons and you could meet some of the folks that we know there. And the reason I started there is because in some ways I think money and the accumulation of money is a symptom of something bigger, right? And I want to begin by tearing down the relational divisions. So the things that I find really transformative, the things that have transformed me, are those relationships. And then the money, the secret is that person will probably not then give $1 million, so give $5 million. No, but it's not about the money though, but I think it's about being free. And it's about finding spaces that are mutually life-giving, right? And I think writing a check is not always mutually life-giving. In fact, I think one of the cheapest ways that we can kind of satiate our conscience is by throwing money at people rather than getting to know them. And I mean, we do it to folks on the street too, right? You see someone that's begging and you give them $5 or $10 because you don't want to do the work of having an interaction. So that's why when people ask me, do you give money to folks that are panhandling, I'm like, let's dig deeper on that, because I think it's not just about the exchange, but as Mother Teresa said, it's about the love that we put into giving it. So that's, I think that's a sort of a starting point. Now, I would say, too, for me, getting the log out of my own eye, I lived off of very little money and then wrote some books that generated a whole lot of money. So what I did within my community is we said, let's create a foundation where we give that money away. So we created a fund called the Jubilee Fund, and we're trying to, share that money as much as we can. But so what I would invite all of us, I guess, to think about is identifying, what do we need to live off of? And then no matter what our income, the money that we generate is, our living expenses don't change too much. And that's how my wife and I live right now. Even within our community, we try to pay everybody the same based on the size of their family and the cost of their living. And Ron Sider, if he were here, he was originally, going to be my partner this weekend, a dear friend. He wrote a great book called Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger. And one of the things that he talks about is a graduated tithe, that if we generate more money, we give more money, and let's just make that kind of codified and really think through, what do I need to live off of? $30,000. So if no matter how much money we generate, we still live off of that. And I'm not even prescribing that for someone else, but I think that's one of the questions, not just how much do we give, but how much do we have left. And a lot of it's about us being free. I think of Gandhi when he rode third class on all of the trains, and someone said to Gandhi, "Why do you ride third class on the trains?" And Gandhi said, "Because there's no fourth class." It's a good line, right? It's just a different way of thinking, that I want to be in solidarity with those who are struggling. So I think upward mobility is kind of a dangerous sort of gravity in the world around us. So
I'd like to follow that up and really get personal about our church. I'm familiar with the finances here, so I know that we give in our outreach efforts enough money to many different organizations who, let's say, all of whom do good work. But would we be wise to scrap all of that, and instead we could easily build perhaps two units of housing right here in this community for people who had a greater need? Would it be better for us to get our hands dirty building houses than to give our money to 24 organizations who also do good, but in such an impersonal, I suppose, way from our point of view?
Cool, thanks. Yeah, so I think I'll dodge that one, let y'all figure that out. But I'll let somebody else, maybe share a little bit. But what I would say is that, some of the things that we talked about yesterday, to me, are about being grounded in our community, right? And they're not about what we do, but how much love is behind that giving. So one of the things that we say over and over, totally from Mother Teresa's line, is what's important is not how much we do, but how much love we put into doing it. And we remind ourselves that we can create hundreds of units of affordable housing, but if people don't have a home, if they don't have someone that loves them, then that's really what it's about. We can have great health care. I was told some people had to leave, and it's not because I made them mad, but because they're a part of the music. Love y'all. See you. We can have great health care, but someone may not have someone holding their hand as they die. So that's kind of what I'm suggesting, that it's not just about what we do, but how much love we're putting into doing it and how rooted that is in the relationships. And I would suggest the programs and the stuff that we do, where we invest our money, follows those relationships, right? So if we've got 4 families from Afghanistan, let's just hypothetically think of that, in our community, then probably we're going to reorient our budget a little bit to create stability and to build into those relationships. And, that's a new thing. It wasn't in last year's budget, but we've got friendships now, and those are important to us. So I think there's a lot of different iterations of that. And one of the ways that I guess I'm suggesting creating a compassion fund is a way that you have a steady base of income that you can then respond to different things in the community, right? So, hey, there was just a fire in the school around the corner. We want to be a part of repairing that. That's in our neighborhood. So we have a mechanism for responding to that. So, even for us, our relationships are that in my neighborhood, I think it's 3% of the folks in my zip code have anything post-high school. 3% have an associate's or any college experience. 97% do not. Not everybody needs to go to college, but that's a pretty big obstacle. So we started to say, we're going to provide 1 scholarship a year for a young person in our neighborhood, right? But it's still relationally based, and it's still someone that we know that we've grown up with, that they want to be, maybe the first generation to go to college in their family, and we support them. So we've created a way to do that. So, thanks for your thought. We got time for 1 or 2 more, I think. Anybody want to share an idea or thought or question?
So it's no surprise that the Lancaster Church at this time is somewhat of an aging congregation. And so do you have experience working with other congregations where they desire to be actively involved in outreach ministries, but because of limitations are not able to be hands-on as much? Other than writing a check, what have you witnessed other church groups doing to actively engage given their circumstances and limited mobility?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really interesting thing to think about a little bit. I think I don't know that some of this is that age is a limiting factor or anything on it. And the reason I would say that is I think of this one group here in Pennsylvania. Actually, the backdrop of the story is really interesting. That this family, their young child, had cancer and was really struggling, and it was going for treatment. They were getting back on a train, I believe it was, and they were going into the train station, and the kid wasn't strong enough to get down the steps. And a homeless man saw that and was like, "Let me help you out," and carried the kid down the steps. And they were really moved by that. And that young man said, "If I make it through this," I mean, this is a kid at the time, if I make it through this, I want to spend my life doing something for homeless folks. And now what that's grown into is a whole ministry of, many of them are folks on the maybe the later part of their life that are sewing blankets and quilts, and they use scrap materials, and they make these really thick bed rolls for folks on the street. And that young man is now one of the folks that heads that up. And but they also got the idea that a lot of folks are cold on the street or even sleeping in abandoned houses, so they weave grocery bags, like the old plastic bags. They strip them, and you might have seen some of these. They then crochet those or make them into these bed rolls that are made out of recycled, grocery bags, are waterproof, they're insulating, and they're really light to carry. So, I mean, I would have never thought of that, right? But I think there's that hope for that the Spirit would birth our imaginations. And I love the idea of Frederick Buechner when he said, we've got to take our passions and connect them to the world's pain. And that's a pretty good example of someone's passion of, quilting or crocheting that then is connecting to someone else's struggle. And there's a lot of variations of that we've seen. Likewise, I think there's young people that bring fresh imagination. Part of what's been incredible, if you've not tracked the Airbnb, is they're going to be welcoming tens of thousands of refugees through the Airbnb network. There's ways of sharing that are really, really innovative, and things that we can have new tools and technology that can allow us to share in new ways, and not to too much pigeonhole people, because I know lots of young people that are not savvy with technology and a lot of old people that are. But, I just think that there's lots of ways that we can use our gifts, we can use our passions, and there's folks that are mentoring people. Like, my mentor's a 90-year-old nun, and so I think we need that kind of cross-pollinating between the generations as well. So thanks for your question. One more, and then we get to worship together. Anybody else want to share a thought or question? Yeah.
So you've been doing this for 20 plus years. Out of that time, is there a moment that you can look back on that was the most rewarding so far?
Well, this is a good day. I think every day's a gift, and certainly I think the longer that we've been in a place, the more fruit there is, just like a tree. I think that when you first plant your garden, it's very fragile, and the longer it's around, the more you can just sit back and enjoy it. And that's kind of where I feel like we're at. Yeah, I think one of the days that was a beautiful one that I'll close us off with this morning was, I'll share a little bit more about this in the service, but we had challenged the anti-homeless laws in Philadelphia and New York City, and had gotten arrested for things like giving away pizza. And that's why we were challenging these laws. And one of the laws was a anti-sleeping ordinance that you couldn't lie down in public in New York City. And so we laid down and were arrested. And we won in court, and we were awarded like $10,000. And this came at a time where we had a number of other gifts that we put together, and we had a Jubilee on Wall Street. And some of you may be familiar with this story, but the reason it was so beautiful was we had our recovery community, we had friends who had been homeless, folks that had been incarcerated, and we all came to Wall Street, and we gave out flyers saying we're going to have a Jubilee celebration, like the Jubilee in the Scripture, which incidentally is very important to notice, right? That this was a way that God commanded us to systemically dismantle inequality. You know, that periodically, not only are we to have a Sabbath day, but we are actually to redistribute land. We are to release people from debt. We're to, set enslaved people free. All these things of Jubilee, like, was God's systemic dismantling. So we said, let's go to Wall Street. Let's give all this money away. And so we broke it up into nickels, dimes, and quarters, and we had $2 bills, and we hid them in different places, and we had a bunch of paper money we were going to dump from a balcony, and so we divided it up among about 100 people, and we came to Wall Street, and we said, if we're going to do the Jubilee, we need a shofar. So does anybody have a ram's horn? And Sister Margaret, my 90-year-old nun friend, she's like, I got one. We're like, of course you do. And so she came and brought it, and we announced, like, God's vision for the world was not for folks to have for a handful of people to have more than they can ever imagine, while masses of people have so much less than they need. And so we announced the Jubilee, and Sister Margaret blew the ram's horn, and then we started dropping money. So folks had bikes, and they came through and dumped money, and we had the balcony folks that dropped the money. And this I'll never forget it, because this is two of the things I remember like it was yesterday. There was someone that swept the street that was coming through, and they had a whole dustpan full of money. And they were like, it's a great day at work, thank you. And then I'll never forget this other guy, that he was on the street, I believe, and came up and he said, listen, I now can get my prescription meds that I couldn't afford, and I'm so grateful for this day. We even had someone that was in the stock exchange that heard the commotion and that came out and was so moved they started buying bagels and giving them out, and they said, this is more fun than what's happening inside, and so there was a contagion to it, right? And I say all that to say, that you don't do that every day, but it was a beautiful day, and I think what it reminded me of is that there are a lot of people that know that the inequities that we're living in right now, they're not good for the poor. They're not good for the rich. And God's coming to set us free with a more life-giving vision. And so at the end of the day, I think that's the invitation, is to say that it's not that this stuff is so bad. It's that it's so good that we want to make sure that we share it like the little kid with the ice cream. So let's do a better job, and let's do it creatively. Let's do it beautifully. Let's pronounce that kind of world where everybody has this day our daily bread. Amen? I'll close this with a prayer a young kid taught that said, Dear God, would you make, this is a little kid that wrote this prayer, would you make everybody rich a little poorer for a while so they can see what that's like? Would you make everybody poor just a little richer so they can see what that's like? And then, God, just bring us all back to medium so we can love each other a little better. Amen. It's not my prayer, but the kids, and I'll see you in the service. Thank you so much.